everyone, and welcome to the August PEM Reads. I am Blair Steck, the Director of Inclusive Philanthropy, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all for what I am sure will be a lively discussion of our book today. I want to just take a moment and I'm going to introduce you to George Schwartz, who is not only the author of our book, Collecting the Globe, the Salem East India Marine Museum, but also a curator here at PEM. George is an associate curator and his interests are in maritime art, material culture, early collecting, and museum history. During his over 2 decades at PEM, he contributed to many of the institution's successful exhibitions, including Fiery Pool, The Maya and the Mythic Sea, Ocean Liners, Glamour, Speed, and Style, and our current exhibition, In American Waters, The Sea in American Painting. The museum, of course, is open now Thursdays through Sundays, and I hope everyone will be able to take a look at this exhibition. It's terrific. George also co-curated the yachting photography of Willard B. Jackson. And just because we really like to go deep into everyone's credentials and share what incredibly talented staff people we have at PEM. George earned his bachelor's degree in anthropology from Brown University, his master's degree in historical archaeology from UMass Boston, and his PhD in American Studies from Boston University. His book, Collecting the Globe, the Salem East India Marine Society Museum, which we will discuss today, explores PEM's origins and illustrates how global objects were used to shape an emerging national identity in the early United States. George has lectured internationally and has written articles and essays for museum catalogs, journals, and magazines. He teaches material culture at Tufts University in the Museum Studies program. And he is an incredible colleague whom we are all so fortunate to get to know. And I'd like to put in that he's also funny. So there you go with that. And without further ado, I'm going to turn everything over to George for his presentation today on the book. Hi, George.
Hi, Blair. Thank you for the introduction. I'll have to look at my joke book, see if I have anything good for today. Thank you all for being here, taking time out of your summer late afternoon, evening. I thought it was very appropriate that one of the piano musical selections was the Police's Message in a Bottle about someone who's lost on an island at sea. So I think very appropriate. Not sure if I can make a joke connecting Tears for Fears, but that's okay. I'll think of that during. So I just want to start off before we sort of delve into the book, just to give a little kind of overview of some like big picture like takeaways that we can sort of discuss and give you sort of a sense of where this book came out of. So my connections to the museum go way back. The book is sort of a culmination of a journey that started in 1984 when I came up to Salem as a young boy. My father, who's an historian of science, knew about the museum and always wanted to visit Salem, so we came up as part of a spring break trip from New York City, Queens, where I grew up, really not next to much water, if you include Flushing Bay. I'm not sure if you would. And the kind of sort of irony of my life is that I was not a museum goer as a very young boy, but coming into this museum and then later getting it spawning an interest in material culture, maritime history, I ended up working at the museum. So kind of, all sort of coincidence, but it's sort of the circuitous journey that we all take in our lives. So there's a picture of me in the blue jacket, my brother next to me standing in front of us, the big anchor in front of East India Marine Hall in 1984. And I remember being captivated by what I saw inside. These stories of an interconnected world that existed many centuries before our world today, which we think is so connected through the internet and other means. And I developed a passion for maritime history and objects that sort of told stories of America's global connections during this period. And then, as I mentioned, when I graduated Brown, like any sort of humanities graduate, I didn't get a job until probably the last month, didn't know what I was doing. Ended up getting fortunate to get a job at the Peabody Essex Museum in Education, and I switched to the Maritime Department very soon after. And so I actually got to really learn the history of the institution, read the books such as Walter Whitehill's sort of sesquicentennial history on the East India Marine Society and the Peabody Museum, which was the only book which had a dedicated chapter on the East India Marine Society, or dedicated chapters, until my publication. And I worked with these objects. They were the objects connected not just to what we think of as the Maritime Department, but the collections of the whole institution are tied by the sea. But I always grew fascinated with sort of knowing more about the story. I mean, I read the books. We knew there's, you probably have many stories that you can relate here in Salem or on the North Shore. We know about the institution, but I wanted to know if that, oh, I see that my thing is in the middle of that picture. Sorry about that. I wanted to see if this story was well known outside of the institution and take a fresh look at it, because it had been so long since someone had examined the origins. And what I came to find, going back to graduate school to get a doctorate, is reading literature on museums to that point, starting in 2011 when I came back, that the East India Marine Society's museum was actually either glossed over, misconstrued, or sometimes left out of writing on early American museums. And when I accessed the questions, accessed the material, and asked new questions, what I found is that the archival material, the East India Marine Society's copious archives that exist at the Phillips Library, 1/3 of the object collection that still exists at the museum, and new sources, new period accounts, they told a different story. They told a story where this museum was not only one of the most important in America at the time, because there were very few museums as we think of today to speak of, but it was also internationally a big player and well known. And so this book really is the culmination of my sort of research to sort of tell this new story, a story that's rooted in America's relationship and connections to the sea. And so the book focuses on the East India Marine Society's museums, influence, its continued legacy. And I think one thing we could discuss is sort of how we could take the lessons we can learn from the institution back then and as it developed, and think of it in the 21st century, and how can the collections be seen or interpreted in our own modern day context. So before we dive in, just sort of give you a sense, as you read on, that, the museum was founded with several principles. It was a marine society, a benevolent institution, but unlike the other American marine societies, forming a museum was part of their bylaws. And Salem at this time, in 1799, was at sort of coming to its apex in terms of its maritime trade and trade routes going all over the globe. So if we think of the Friendship model down here, which was built by members of the crew of the Friendship on a voyage to the East Indies, Sumatra, in 1805, 1806, this was not only a sort of representation of a ship that was going out of Salem, but this was also the conduit for bringing back all sorts of objects from around the globe. So trading, obviously acquiring goods to bring back to Salem and then either sell to people in town or re-export, was the principal objective. But a byproduct was the fact that these Salem ships were going all over the globe and bringing back objects on the ship. So if we think of sailing in those days, you wouldn't go out of New England with the products of, that were readily at hand, like wood staves or salt cod and other ginseng. You wouldn't really fetch much on the Chinese market, which is sort of was the desired route or the desired place to trade with. with those goods. So you would sort of trade at different ports and acquire other goods. So if you were going in Salem those days, you might go directly to China around the Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean. You might be trading in India or out in going into China. Or you might be going around Cape Horn, going to the northwest coast, North America, or the Pacific Islands to acquire goods that were profitable in the Chinese market. And I always like to joke that Salem mariners were so adept and so skilled they could sail a ship backwards, like I just showed. So some of the objects that were coming through to Salem were some of the first, not only for Salem, but for America, the first penguin in a North American museum. I'm sure many of you are familiar with our improperly stuffed long-necked penguin that was given by George Hodges in 1823, captured in the Falkland Islands. Wonderful objects from the Pacific Islands, which were sort of the largest majority of the collection came from that region of the world. But even though the East Indian Marine Society said they were collecting to form a museum of natural and artificial curiosities from one of the two capes, or beyond one of the two capes, they collected objects from all over the globe. And here we have a 19th century version of a Renaissance painting of the Death of Abel, which were acquired by Salem families that went on what are called like American Grand Tours in that period of the 19th century. East Indian Marine Hall is a fixture not only for Salem then, but now, but back in those days, here it is in the 1840s. It was a place to sort of escape the normal humdrum of a provincial New England town and sort of having a global multi-sensory experience. Before you would even enter the galleries, though, you were greeted by this painting, the first marine scene in the collection, commissioned by the East Indian Marine Society from Michel Felice Cornet, who came to Salem in 1799 and became the first painter in America to specialize in marine subjects. And it's one that really started, it was an easy decision for a cover of the book. I didn't have to negotiate with UMass Press. They agreed that this is, a wonderful cover, but it also was something that allowed you as a visitor in the 19th century to sort of get a sense of what you might experience behind the museum's walls. So this maritime scene, a ship about to depart Salem Harbor, sort of optimistic pinkish hues, but clouds, which might depict sort of ominous things. The sea both gave and took away. And you also have these sort of classical derived figures, or these, putti holding the banner that was later stenciled East Indian Marine Hall by another artist, because in those days East Indian Marine Hall didn't exist in 1803, it was built in 1825. And then this woman who might be an allusion to Columbia, an early personification of America, sort of gesturing towards this scene, sort of an open embrace, sort of gesturing the viewer or the visitor to come experience what lies behind these walls. In those days, you would enter East Indian Marine Hall through an entrance that's behind the anchor today. You would come to that, down a long corridor to the set of stairs we're so familiar with. And you would approach, if you were not familiar with the museum, you might approach these stairs and really not have a sense of what lay ahead. You can see, and you can recall from your own memories, when you hit that landing, you don't really see anything. But once you turn around, that's when the sort of expansiveness of East Indian Marine Hall is really palpable. And in those days, you really were sort of greeted by experience connected to the sea. So here's East Indian Marine Hall from a few years ago. So looking south, those south windows back in the 19th century, you would see the boats from different parts of the world. Our favorite and well-known figure of Kukulakaimoko, who stood on a Kamehameha temple that overlooked the sea. So something also connected to the sea. If you turned around and looked the north face windows onto Essex Street, you would have the same experience. You have, boat models. You have these giant sea sponges known as Neptune cups, 4 and 7 here, figures of merchants from different parts of the globe. behind this one of a Chinese merchant, you had a plaster cast of the famous classical sculpture, the Laocoon group, that was given to the museum in 1824, 1825. It also has a maritime connection, and it actually was the one piece in the collection that sort of stood above and below the water line. So you could think of the boats on the water. You could think of those Neptune cups I showed below the water. Here we have a scene of the Trojan priest Laocoon angering Poseidon and being ensnared by a sea serpent along with his two sons. He probably did something, we don't know, to anger Poseidon, but he's also the priest who warned the Trojans years before not to take in the Trojan horse. I think you know what happened there. And if we looked at the west and east face windows of East India Marine Hall, this is where the majority of the collection was. Very global, large natural history specimens like sperm whales' jaws on the left. You had objects from the Pacific Islands, those 19th century copies of classical painting or Renaissance paintings. You had busts of deities and American patriots at that point. Portraits of members like Nathaniel Bowditch and other revered mariners. Like here's a portrait of Captain Cook that Michel Felice Cornet painted on commission from the East India Marine Society. But he also had on that same level portraits of, number 11 is the portrait of Esching, a Hong merchant in China who was a revered trading partner. That painting is in the Asian Export Art Galleries currently in the new wing, and figures of deities from all over the globe sort of looking down upon people. So it was an perfect system, though. There was this what we would call Orientalism, this sort of Anglo-Eurocentric slant. You had these figures of Indian merchants. Some were commissioned in India, but some were actually put together in Salem. And of course, they had been sent by Indian trading partners, but they were put on display by East India Marine Society members. So they still had control over the sort of narrative. So even though imperfect and sort of a principle, kind of a sense of othering in many ways, it did give people a sense of what it meant to sort of be America in these days, that here is Salem and America on a global stage. Of course, that narrative is filled with complexities. It's as we dig deeper and deeper over time, and especially now, we know that not everyone was equal, that the sort of application of American ideals was not even-handed. The visitors match this global story. Here we have Yafeng of Guangdong province. Each signed his name in his native Chinese characters, the way he would sign it. Below, Julian Rosenkowski from Poland, who wrote that he was from all world. So going through these books, as I mentioned in my book, going through these guest books, which exist for 2/3 of the East India Marine Society's tenure of owning the museum, gives a richer story of who visited and allowed me to sort of find period accounts of people visiting like you do, like I do, like everyone does, and gravitating to objects they liked, like our famous miniature rosary bead, which still I think brings awe and splendor to all who see it. That was the way it was in the 19th century. It was one of the most popular objects talked about by many who had written accounts. Anne Royal, the first American female journalist in the United States, called it a most extraordinary piece of ingenuity. But I like to always, and I think this is maybe a good place to start discussion, because this object, which was the first given by Captain Jonathan Carnes, is for the first donation to the museum, this double-ended pipe from Sumatra that was not made in Sumatra, but collected there and still puzzles many art historians. Its form encapsulates the sort of multiple ways we could view objects. I like to say, looking at it, we can look at both the past, the present, and the future, and get a sense of how we interpret this collection in the 21st century. I'll give you one quick example before I stop sharing my screen, but if we think of Ku, in the day when it was on display in Eastern Marine Hall or maybe in other parts of the museum throughout the 20th century. Ku is now co-stewarded with a native Hawaiian cultural practitioners who guide his handling and presentation. So that's how he was set up for his current display. And you can see him from Essex Street elevated to his ceremonial height. He faces westward towards Hawaii and is properly dressed in a malo or loincloth. And the interpretation is more collaborative, noting how Ku inspires continuity, agency, and a return to traditional ways for many contemporary native Hawaiians. And the label itself is translated into Hawaiian. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you. That was terrific.